For 38 years, Eleanor watched over our living room from above the fireplace. That Friday evening, I came home and found my daughter-in-law had replaced her with herself. My wife's portrait was no longer on the wall. In its place hung a massive glossy wedding photograph of my son Adam and his wife Kelsey, smiling under an arch of white roses. Below it, leaning against a cardboard box, was Eleanor, wrapped in a damp bath towel, face toward the wall. I stood there in the archway, holding a brown paper grocery bag in my arms, staring at the towel wrapped around my wife's face. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I am 69 years old, a retired bank security consultant. I have spent my entire life evaluating risk, managing threats, and keeping my emotions locked behind a steel door. But in that moment, seeing the woman I loved discarded like garbage, the steel door rattled on its hinges. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs. Kelsey came walking down into the living room, holding a heavy claw hammer in her right hand. She was dressed in expensive athleisure wear, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight, practical ponytail. She stopped when she saw me standing there. "Oh, good," Kelsey said, brushing a speck of drywall dust off her shoulder. "You saw it." My son Adam stepped off the bottom stair and stood behind her. He was 41, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt from his failing logistics job, and he immediately pulled out his cell phone, pretending to check an urgent email so he wouldn't have to look me in the eye. I looked at him anyway. "You took down your mother?" I asked him. Adam shifted his weight, looking desperately at his screen. "Dad, it was just a painting." "No, Adam," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. It was the only part of this room that still knew how to tell the truth. Kelsey answered before he could try to defend himself. "This house needs to stop worshipping dead people, Robert," Kelsey stated. Her voice brisk and entirely unapologetic. The words landed harder than the hammer she was gripping in her hand. I looked at her. Kelsey had married Adam 3 years ago. From the moment she stepped through the front door, she had looked at my home not as a place of refuge, but as a piece of undeveloped real estate. She saw the vintage furniture, the heavy drapes, and the quiet routines of an old widower as obstacles in the way of her own lifestyle expansion. She wanted the house to be the headquarters of the new generation, and to do that, she needed to evict the previous one. I did not yell. I did not rip her massive, glossy wedding photo off the wall and smash it over the stone hearth, even though my hands twitched with the sudden, violent urge to do exactly that. I simply set my grocery bag down on the coffee table. I walked over to the fireplace, knelt down, and carefully lifted Eleanor's heavy portrait from the floor. I pulled the damp bath towel away, checking the canvas to ensure the paint hadn't been damaged. When I stood up, holding the portrait against my chest, I looked at the bare wall where it had hung for 38 years. Or rather, I looked at what Kelsey had inadvertently exposed by taking it down. What Kelsey had exposed was not obvious to anyone who did not know where to look. Just below the new wedding photo, hidden in the shadow of the mantel, was a faint square seam in the old walnut backing Eleanor had insisted we build into the wall. To Kelsey, it must have looked like old paneling. To me, it was a heavy flush-mounted steel door, a wall safe. Kelsey followed my gaze. She squinted, stepping closer to the fireplace. "What is that?" Kelsey frowned, pointing the hammer at the metal square. "Was that behind the painting?" I looked at the 6-inch steel door. My wife had insisted on installing it 20 years ago, sinking it directly into the brickwork of the chimney breast, hiding it perfectly behind the canvas of her own face. Then I looked at my daughter-in-law, whose ambition had just outpaced her intelligence. "That," I said quietly, "is the reason Eleanor stayed on that wall." I didn't explain. I turned around and walked out of the living room, carrying Eleanor in my arms. I took the portrait into my ground-floor study, a room Kelsey rarely entered because it smelled like old books and pipe tobacco. I set the painting carefully on my heavy oak desk, resting it against the wall so Eleanor was looking out at the room. I sat down in my leather armchair, steepled my fingers, and looked at her. Eleanor had been a force of nature. When we bought this house 40 years ago, it was a dilapidated wreck. We spent our first 3 years sleeping on an air mattress in the dining room while we tore down walls, replaced plumbing, and sanded floors until our hands bled. We didn't just buy the house, we earned it. On our 25th anniversary, business at my security consulting firm was booming. We had finally paid off the mortgage. To celebrate, I commissioned a local artist to paint Eleanor's portrait. I wanted to capture her exactly as she was in that era of our lives, confident, brilliant, and fiercely protective of the family we had built. When the painting arrived, I suggested hanging it in the formal dining room, or perhaps the front entryway. Eleanor had shaken her head immediately. "No," she had said, pointing directly at the space above the living room fireplace, the absolute center of the house. "It goes there." I remember laughing, telling her it might seem a bit grandiose to put a massive oil painting of herself in the main gathering space. Eleanor hadn't laughed back. She had looked at the empty wall with a strange, intense focus. A house needs one place where the truth can look back at everyone, Eleanor had told me, her voice dropping into a register she only used when she was entirely serious. "People will walk into this room, Robert. They will smile at you, they will eat your food, and they will try to figure out what they can take from you. I want them to look up and know that I see exactly who they are." She had been right, of course. She was almost always right. Adam grew up under the watchful gaze of that portrait. He was a sweet boy, but he lacked his mother's spine. He hated conflict. He hated making hard decisions. As he got older and his business ventures began to falter, he started looking for someone else to steer the ship. He found Kelsey. Kelsey was a woman who navigated life by treating everyone around her as either an asset or a liability. When she realized I had no intention of moving into a retirement community and handing the deed of the house over to them, I immediately became a liability. A year before Eleanor died, the cancer had confined her mostly to the ground floor. She spent her days sitting in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, reading books and watching the fire. She also watched Kelsey. Kelsey and Adam had moved into the guest bedrooms upstairs temporarily while they were between houses. That temporary stay had stretched into 3 years. I remember coming home from the pharmacy one afternoon to find Eleanor sitting in her chair, staring up at her own portrait. The wall safe had been installed just a week prior. I had spent 2 days drilling into the masonry, grumbling about the dust, while Eleanor supervised. "I don't know what you plan on keeping in there," I had joked, wiping sweat from my forehead. "We keep the cash and the jewelry in the floor safe in the bedroom." Eleanor had smiled, a small, tight expression. "Behind every good woman," Eleanor had replied softly, "is a secret drawer a foolish man should not ignore." I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. To be honest, in the 5 years since she passed, I had never once opened the wall safe. I knew the combination, of course. It was the date we closed on the house, but whatever Eleanor had placed inside it, I hadn't felt the need to disturb it. The safe was just another part of the house, quiet and waiting until today. I sat in my study, listening to the sounds coming from the living room. I could hear Kelsey complaining about the dust outline the portrait had left on the wall. I could hear Adam's low, murmuring voice, agreeing with whatever she said, desperately trying to keep the peace. They thought they had won. Kelsey thought she had removed my wife from the wall. What she had really done was uncover the one place Eleanor had left to protect me. Tomorrow, while Kelsey was busy planning her new chapter, I was going to open the one chapter Eleanor had written without telling anyone. The erasure of my wife did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical campaign of attrition, executed over the course of the weekend under the guise of freshening up the house. Saturday morning began with the china cabinet. I sat in my study, The door cracked open just enough to see the dining room. Kelsey had hired 2 burly movers off the internet. I watched them carefully wrap Eleanor's vintage bone china, the set we had spent 5 years assembling from estate sales across the state, in cheap bubble wrap, and shove them into cardboard boxes. Just put them in the basement behind the holiday decorations, Kelsey instructed the movers, pointing toward the cellar door. It's all just grief clutter anyway. We need the space for the new serving pieces. Adam was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a hangover and a cup of black coffee. Are you sure we should move Mom's china? Adam asked weakly, rubbing his temples. Dad might be upset. He likes seeing it there. Adam, your father is holding on to things that don't matter, Kelsey replied, her tone dripping with the kind of exasperated patience a teacher uses with a slow child. We are hosting the new chapter dinner next Saturday. We have 20 guests coming, including Martin Cole from the bank. We can't serve a catered meal on mismatched plates from the 1980s. It makes us look stagnant. She paused, walking over to massage Adam's shoulders. We are building a future here, babe, Kelsey said softly. This house is going to be ours. We need to start making it look like it belongs to us, not to a ghost. Adam sighed, leaning into her touch. Yeah, you're right. I closed the door to my study. By Sunday afternoon, the heavy dark velvet drapes Eleanor had sewn herself were stripped from the living room windows, replaced by sheer, aggressively modern blinds that let in too much harsh sunlight. The antique Persian rug in the foyer was rolled up and banished to the attic. And then came the conversation about the sunroom. Eleanor had loved the sunroom. It faced east, catching the early morning light. She had filled it with orchids, a comfortable reading chaise, and a small writing desk. For 5 years, I had kept the plants watered and the desk dusted. It was the quietest room in the house. I've been looking at the dimensions of Eleanor's room, Kelsey announced over a tense Sunday dinner. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at Adam. If we knock down the non-load-bearing wall connecting it to the guest bath, it would make a perfect nursery and home office combo. I stopped chewing my steak. You want to demolish the sunroom? I asked. We want to utilize the square footage, Robert, Kelsey corrected smoothly, taking a delicate sip of her wine. It's prime real estate, just sitting empty. And since Adam and I are expanding our horizons, well, we need the space. She looked around the dining room, her eyes gleaming with proprietary satisfaction. I am not living under another woman's shadow, Robert. I'm not living in a museum. This is a family headquarters now. Adam kept his eyes glued to his plate. He didn't say a word. They left for work early Monday morning. Adam drove off to his logistics firm, and Kelsey left for her job at a boutique marketing agency. The moment I heard the electric garage door hum shut, a profound, heavy silence settled over the house. I walked into the living room. The morning sun was cutting harshly through Kelsey's new sheer blinds, illuminating the massive, glossy wedding photograph that now dominated the space above the fireplace. I looked at the smiles on their faces. They looked so confident. They looked like people who had already won a war without having to fight a single battle. I stepped up onto the stone hearth. I reached up and gripped the edges of the heavy wooden frame. I lifted the massive wedding photograph off its brass hooks and carefully set it down on the floor, leaning it against the coffee table. The wall above the fireplace was bare again, save for the faint, square seam cut into the old walnut paneling. I ran my fingers over the seam. It was practically invisible unless you knew exactly what you were feeling for. I pressed hard on the top right corner of the square. With a soft, mechanical click, a small section of the wood popped outward, revealing a digital keypad embedded flush into the heavy steel door of the wall safe. The keypad had not been touched in 5 years. There was a thin layer of dust on the rubber buttons. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands. I typed in 4 numbers, Bool 814, August 14th, the day Eleanor and I had closed on the house. A green light flashed on the keypad. Deep inside the masonry of the chimney, heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a solid, satisfying thunk. I pulled the heavy door open. The inside of the safe smelled exactly like the inside of the cedar closet, a faint, dry scent of old paper and lavender. The interior was meticulously organized, exactly the way Eleanor had left it. There were 3 distinct compartments. In the top compartment, resting flat, was a thick manila envelope labeled Property and Trust. In the middle compartment was a red accordion folder labeled Signatures and Security. And in the bottom compartment, sitting perfectly alone on the cold steel shelf, was a small, black USB flash drive. Resting on top of a folded piece of stationery that simply read, Play Me, I carefully removed all 3 items and carried them into my study. I sat down at my heavy oak desk. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm, the kind of adrenaline you feel right before the storm finally breaks. I opened the manila envelope first. Inside was the original notarized deed to the house on Elm Street. I unfolded it, scanning the legal jargon. Eleanor and I had purchased the house jointly, but attached to the deed was a secondary document filed 3 weeks before Eleanor died. It was a transfer of ownership into the Eleanor Bennett Revocable Trust. I knew about the trust, of course. Evelyn Price, our family attorney, had set it up years ago. But reading the specific language Eleanor had insisted upon sent a cold shiver down my spine. The document clearly stated that upon her death, the trust became irrevocable, and I retained sole, absolute, lifetime executive control over the property. Adam was listed only as a secondary, conditional beneficiary. He didn't own a single brick of the house, and he wouldn't as long as I was breathing. I set the deed aside and opened the red accordion folder labeled Signatures and Security. Inside were a dozen high-quality, notarized photocopies of my driver's license, my passport, and multiple samples of my signature collected across various legal documents. Attached to these was a printed list of phone numbers, the fraud department of my bank, the 3 major credit bureaus, and the direct line to Evelyn Price. Eleanor hadn't just left me paperwork. She had left me an entire identity theft protection kit, curated by hand. Why would she do that? I looked at the small black USB drive resting on the desk. I reached over and booted up my laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale bluish glow over the dark wood of the study. I inserted the USB drive. A single video file popped up on the screen, titled simply, For Robert. I clicked on it. The video player opened. The screen was black for a moment, and then the image resolved. My breath caught in my throat. It was Eleanor. She was sitting in her favorite armchair in the sunroom, the very room Kelsey was planning to demolish. The video was clearly recorded during the final months of her life. She looked frail, her cheekbones sharp and pronounced, a cozy knitted blanket draped over her lap to hide the weight she had lost. But her eyes, those sharp, brilliant, piercing eyes, were entirely unchanged. They looked directly into the camera lens with a ferocious, unyielding intensity. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I just stared at the screen, desperately drinking in the sight of my wife. Eleanor's face froze on the television screen, and her voice filled the room. "Robert," she said, her voice raspy but steady, "if you are watching this, someone moved me before they understood why I was there." The video continued to play. I sat frozen in my leather armchair, listening to the voice I had not heard in 5 years. "I know our son, Robert," Eleanor said, looking out from the screen with a mixture of profound love and sharp clarity. "I love Adam. I will always love him. But he has always loved the idea of an inheritance more than he loves the responsibility of one. He wants the comfort of the destination without the difficult journey of getting there." She shifted slightly in her chair, pulling the knitted blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Adam is easily led by people who promise him easy answers," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping into that serious register she used when discussing the family's future. And I know the woman he married. Kelsey does not look at our home and see the life we built. She looks at it and sees equity. She sees collateral. She sees a stepping stone for her own ambitions. Eleanor leaned forward, pointing a thin finger directly at the camera lens. If someone has taken my portrait down, Robert, it means they are no longer asking for permission to run your life. It means they have already decided they are in charge. They think I am just an old memory they can pack away in a box. But I am not leaving you unprotected. She pointed to the left side of the screen, indicating the red folder I had just pulled from the safe. Open the security folder, Robert. Check the deed. Check your credit. Call the bank. Because if they took me down, they didn't do it for decoration. They did it because they need the walls for themselves. The video ended, fading to a stark black screen. I sat in the silence of my study for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Eleanor had not possessed some mystical power to see the future. She simply had the profound, unsettling ability to see people exactly as they were. I opened the red accordion folder labeled Signatures and Security. I pulled out the list of phone numbers Eleanor had compiled. I picked up the landline on my desk and dialed the first number on the list, the fraud monitoring department of the major credit bureau. I spent 20 minutes answering security questions, verifying my identity, and requesting a verbal summary of any recent activity on my credit file. Mr. Bennett, the customer service representative said over the speakerphone, I am seeing a hard inquiry placed on your file 4 days ago. It originated from First National Bank regarding an application for a home equity line of credit against your primary residence on Elm Street. My blood ran cold. I did not authorize any such application, I said, my voice dangerously calm. The application is currently marked as pending, sir, the representative replied. It has not been funded. I can place a hard freeze on your credit file immediately to prevent further action, if you'd like. Yes, I said. Freeze it all. I hung up the phone. First National Bank. That was the local branch where I had kept my business accounts for 30 years. The branch manager was a man named Martin Cole, and Martin Cole was one of the 20 guests Kelsey had invited to her new chapter dinner this coming Saturday. It suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. Kelsey wasn't just throwing a dinner party to show off her new decor. She was throwing a dinner party to socially trap me. She intended to announce her massive renovation plans in front of our neighbors, her parents, and the bank manager, putting me in a position where refusing the loan would mean causing a massive public scene. She thought I would just smile, nod, and sign the final paperwork to avoid the embarrassment. She thought I was just a tired old man who would rather surrender than fight. I picked up the phone again and dialed the direct line for Evelyn Price. Evelyn was not just a property lawyer. She was a pit bull in a tailored suit. She had handled the closing of this house 40 years ago, and she had drafted Eleanor's trust. When I explained what the credit bureau had told me, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'll be at your house in 20 minutes, Robert, Evelyn said sharply. Do not say a word to Adam or Kelsey when they get home. Act completely normal. While I waited for Evelyn, I walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee. Sitting on the kitchen island was a silver tablet. It was an older model iPad that Kelsey kept in the kitchen to look up recipes and play music while she cooked. I normally never touched it. But Eleanor's voice was echoing in my head. They didn't do it for decoration. I tapped the screen. It wasn't locked with a passcode. Kelsey felt so secure in her control of my house that she didn't even bother to secure her devices. I opened her messaging app. I didn't have to scroll far. There was a long text thread with Adam from last Thursday, the day before they took down the portrait. I read the blue and gray bubbles, feeling a physical sickness rise in my stomach. Kelsey, the interior designer just sent the estimate for the sunroom demo and the nursery build. It's going to be $85K. We need to submit the HELOC application by tomorrow, Adam. Asterisk. Are you sure we shouldn't just talk to Dad first? If he finds out we applied for a loan against the house without telling him, he's going to lose it. Asterisk, Kelsey. Your father will never agree if we ask. He thinks every wall belongs to Eleanor. He wants to live in a mausoleum. Asterisk, Adam. It just feels wrong, Kels. It's his house. Asterisk, Kelsey. Adam, we talked about this. It is going to be mine someday. It's going to be ours. We can't put our family on hold just because he refuses to move on. Asterisk, Adam. I know. It is going to be mine someday. I just wish we didn't have to sneak around. Asterisk, Kelsey. Asterisk. Then stop acting like a guest in your own future. I already scanned his driver's license from his desk drawer. I intercepted the property tax bill from the mail yesterday, so we have the parcel number. I'll e-sign the application and send it to Martin at First National. I stared at the screen. My own son had known. He had felt a twinge of guilt. But he had allowed his wife to commit identity theft against his own father simply because it was easier than standing up to her. He had traded my security for his comfort. The doorbell rang. I let Evelyn in. She marched into the kitchen, dropping her heavy leather briefcase onto the island next to the tablet. She was 65, sharp-eyed, and completely devoid of patience for fools. I pulled the preliminary application file through a contact at First National, Evelyn said, pulling a stack of papers from her briefcase. Kelsey submitted an application for a $150,000 home equity line of credit. She listed you as the primary applicant and herself as the authorized property manager. How did it even get past the initial review? I asked, looking at the forged electronic signature at the bottom of the page. Martin Cole has known me for 30 years. She was clever, Evelyn admitted grimly. She attached a scanned copy of your ID, a copy of the deed, and a letter, forged, obviously, stating that your health was declining and you had authorized her to handle the preliminary paperwork. Martin probably pushed it through to pending status as a courtesy, assuming you would sign the final closing documents at the dinner party she invited him to. She wants to renovate the sunroom, I said quietly, pointing to the tablet. I found her messages to Adam. He knew about it. He knew she was forging my signature. Evelyn's eyes hardened. She walked over to the tablet and quickly scrolled through the conversation, taking pictures of the screen with her own phone for evidence. "Robert," Evelyn said, turning to look at me. "I know this is your son. I know this is painful. But I need you to understand the legal reality of what we are looking at." "I understand," I said. "No, listen to me," Evelyn insisted, her voice sharp. "A forged signature does not become family business just because it was written at the kitchen table. This isn't a misunderstanding over inheritance. This is loan fraud. It is a federal offense. If this loan closes, they put a lien on your property. If they default on the payments, the bank takes the house Eleanor built." She pointed a finger at the printed application. "They tried to steal your house while you were sitting in the next room," Evelyn said. I looked at the forged signature on the paper. I thought about Eleanor's portrait, wrapped in a damp towel, shoved against a cardboard box. I thought about Kelsey holding a hammer, looking at me with total contempt, while my son hid behind his phone. "They are hosting a dinner this Saturday," I said, my voice steady. "They are calling it a new chapter dinner. They want Martin Cole there to finalize the loan in public. They want my neighbors and her parents there to force my hand." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a predatory glint appearing in her eyes. "Oh, they want an audience?" "Yes," I said. "They want an audience." "Then let's give them a show," Evelyn said. "I will call Martin Cole. I will make sure he brings the final loan documents to the dinner, exactly as Kelsey planned. But he will also bring the fraud department's cancellation notice." I nodded slowly, feeling the steel door inside my chest lock into place. Evelyn placed the loan packet on my kitchen table and tapped the signature line. "Robert," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet house. "This is not family pressure anymore. This is fraud. Saturday evening arrived with the stifling, manufactured perfection of a stage play. By 6 o'clock, the transformation of my house was entirely complete. Kelsey had hired a professional catering staff who were currently bustling around my kitchen, arranging artisanal hors d'oeuvres on geometric slate slabs. The heavy oak dining table that Eleanor and I had polished by hand was completely hidden beneath a stark, icy white linen tablecloth. The warm amber lighting had been replaced by glaring, hyper-modern LED fixtures that made the room feel less like a home and more like a corporate boardroom. Kelsey was floating through the space in a sleek, tailored black cocktail dress, holding a flute of champagne, radiating the smug confidence of a conqueror surveying her newly won territory. Adam trailed behind her in a forced, uncomfortable suit, looking like a man who knew he was walking into a trap but couldn't find the courage to turn around. The guests began to arrive at 6:30. Kelsey's parents, Richard and Diane, were the first to walk through the door. They were loud, ostentatious people who immediately began complimenting their daughter on how much better the house looked now that the dreary old things had been cleared out. Next came the interior designer, a woman named Chloe, who brought a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints for the sunroom demolition. Then came Nora Alvarez. Nora had lived next door for 35 years. She and Eleanor had drank coffee on the back porch every Tuesday morning for a decade. Nora walked into the living room, took one look at the massive wedding photo hanging where Eleanor's portrait belonged, and her face tightened into a mask of polite, rigid fury. She caught my eye from across the room, and I gave her a microscopic nod. She understood immediately that tonight was not what it seemed. At 7 o'clock, Martin Cole arrived. Martin was a vice president at First National Bank. He was 55, wearing a sharp navy suit, carrying a slim leather portfolio under his arm. He looked slightly nervous, likely because finalizing a $150,000 loan at a dinner party was highly irregular, even for high-net-worth clients. "Robert," Martin said, approaching me with an outstretched hand. "It's good to see you looking so well. Kelsey mentioned you had been feeling under the weather lately." "I have never felt better, Martin," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm glad you brought the paperwork." Martin smiled, visibly relieved. Of course. It's just a few final signatures. We can take care of it right after dessert." The final guest arrived exactly at 7:15. Evelyn Price walked through the front door, wearing a charcoal pantsuit and carrying a heavy, battered leather briefcase. Kelsey's smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw the lawyer. "Evelyn," Kelsey said, stepping forward, "I didn't realize Robert had invited you. This is really just a close family celebration." "I've handled the legal affairs for this property for 40 years, Kelsey," Evelyn replied, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. "And when Robert told me you were launching a new chapter for the house, I wouldn't have missed it for the world." We moved to the dining room. Kelsey had arranged the seating so that she and Adam sat at the head of the table, flanked by her parents and the interior designer. I was placed further down, near the kitchen door, symbolically seated as a guest in my own home. Martin Cole sat directly across from me, his leather portfolio resting on the floor beside his chair. The caterers served a meticulously plated dinner of roasted duck and root vegetables. The conversation was dominated by Kelsey and her mother, loudly discussing the future. "The sunroom really is dead space," Diane announced to the table, waving her fork. "Once it's knocked out, the flow of the entire ground floor will be so much more dynamic. It's exactly what a young, modern family needs." Adam took a long, desperate swallow of his wine, refusing to look in my direction. As the plates were cleared and dessert was brought out, Kelsey stood up and tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon. A hush fell over the room. "Thank you all for being here," Kelsey began, projecting her voice perfectly. She looked around the table, her eyes resting briefly on the massive wedding photograph visible through the archway in the living room. When Adam and I moved in here, we knew this house had a lot of history, but history shouldn't hold us back. Tonight is about honoring the past by moving forward. Tonight is about letting this house belong to the living. Kelsey's parents beamed. Adam stared at the table. And to that end, Kelsey continued, turning her bright, predatory smile toward the bank manager. Martin, I believe you have something that will help us officially unlock the potential of this property. Martin Cole chuckled nervously. He reached down, picked up his leather portfolio, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, complete with brightly colored "Sign Here" sticky notes. Yes, well, Martin said, standing up slightly to slide the paperwork across the table toward me. It's highly unusual, but as requested, I have the final closing documents for the home equity line of credit. Robert, if you could just sign on the marked lines, the funds will be released on Monday morning. Kelsey looked at me. The trap was sprung. She fully expected me to pick up the pen, sign away the equity of the house I built with Eleanor, and quietly accept my obsolescence. I didn't pick up the pen. I picked up the television remote, resting on the sideboard next to my chair. Before I sign anything, I said, my voice cutting through the expectant silence like a serrated blade. I think we should let the original owner of this house give her blessing. I pressed a button on the remote. In the living room, the massive 80-inch smart television flickered to life. I had spent the afternoon mirroring my laptop to the screen. The volume was routed through the surround sound system. Eleanor's face filled the screen. The entire dining room froze. Kelsey's confident smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, bewildered horror. Diane gasped. Nora Alvarez sat up perfectly straight, a fierce, proud gleam appearing in her eyes. Robert! Eleanor's voice echoed through the house, sharp and commanding. If you are watching this, someone moved me before they understood why I was there. Kelsey turned to Adam, her face pale. Adam, turn that off. Turn it off right now. Adam didn't move. He was staring at the screen, completely paralyzed by the sight of his mother. I know our son, Robert, Eleanor continued on the screen. I love Adam. I will always love him. But he has always loved the idea of an inheritance more than he loves the responsibility of one. Adam flinched, physically shrinking into his chair as his mother's words hit him like a physical blow. Adam, Eleanor said, looking directly into the camera, her eyes seemingly burning through the screen to lock onto him in the dining room. Loving your wife does not require betraying your father. Kelsey slammed her hands down on the table, rattling the fine crystal. This is insane, Robert, turn that off. This is incredibly inappropriate. I pressed pause on the remote. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I stood up from my chair. 38 years ago, I said, looking directly at Kelsey. My wife asked me to hang her portrait above the fireplace. She said a house needs one place where the truth can look back at everyone. I walked over to the stack of loan documents Martin Cole had placed on the table. When you took her picture down on Friday, I continued, my voice low and hard, you exposed the wall safe hidden directly behind the canvas. You thought you were removing a memory. What you actually did was uncover the deed, the trust documents, and Eleanor's instructions on exactly what to do when her son's wife finally tried to steal our home. Steal, Diane sputtered indignantly. Now see here, Robert, they are just trying to renovate. Quiet, Diane. Evelyn Price snapped, standing up from the table. The lawyer's voice cracked like a whip, instantly silencing Kelsey's mother. Evelyn walked over to Martin Cole. She opened her heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the preliminary loan application and the printed screenshots of Kelsey and Adam's text messages. Martin, Evelyn said, placing the forged application on top of the final closing documents. Who signed this preliminary application? Martin Cole looked at the forged signature, then looked at Evelyn, the blood draining rapidly from his face. Kelsey submitted it. She provided a scanned copy of Robert's ID and a letter stating he had authorized her to handle the digital paperwork because he was unwell. "I am the executor of the Eleanor Bennett Revocable Trust," Evelyn stated coldly to the entire room. "Robert Bennett has sole, absolute, lifetime executive control over this property. Adam has no present ownership. Kelsey has no legal standing whatsoever." Evelyn pointed a sharp finger at the forged signature. "A forged signature does not become family business because it was written at the kitchen table," Evelyn said, her eyes locked on Kelsey. "This is not renovation planning. This is loan fraud." The words hit the room like a bomb. Chloe, the interior designer, slowly reached down, picked up her blueprints, and quietly backed away from the table, desperate to distance herself from a federal crime. Martin Cole stood up immediately, grabbing his leather portfolio. His face was a mask of sheer, terrified self-preservation. "I had no idea," Martin said loudly, ensuring everyone in the room heard him. He snatched the final closing documents off the table and shoved them into his bag. "I was assured this was a consensual family arrangement. Pending a full internal investigation, this application is terminated. Immediately." "You can't do that!" Kelsey shrieked, her carefully constructed facade completely shattering. She looked wildly around the room. Realizing that her parents were staring at her in horrified embarrassment, the bank manager was fleeing, and her husband was hiding his face in his hands. Kelsey turned to me, tears of rage and humiliation spilling down her cheeks. "It was just a picture," Kelsey screamed, her voice cracking. "It was just an old, ugly painting of a dead woman. Why are you destroying our future over a piece of canvas?" I looked at her. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from her shaking frame. "You moved her picture because you thought she was gone," I told her, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the dining room. "She was the only reason you still had a roof." Kelsey stared at me, her mouth open, the reality of her total ruin finally sinking in. She had tried to stage a coronation, and instead she had organized her own execution. I looked at my son, who was still staring at the frozen image of his mother on the television screen. "I am tired, Adam," I said. "I think it is time for you and your wife to leave my house." Kelsey had built the evening around a new chapter. Eleanor's video turned it into an ending. The collapse of Kelsey's grand vision was swift and absolute. She did not leave the house that night with quiet dignity. She left screaming, sobbing, and desperately trying to convince her horrified parents that she had been manipulated into the entire scheme. Richard and Diane didn't listen. They practically dragged their daughter out the front door, deeply embarrassed by the sudden, brutal exposure of her criminal ambition. Adam left with them, walking out into the cold night air with his head bowed, carrying a single overnight bag. By Monday morning, the legal reality of the situation locked into place. Evelyn Price was merciless. She sent formal cease and desist letters to First National Bank, ensuring that not only was the fraudulent home equity line of credit permanently terminated, but an internal flag was placed on my profile requiring my physical presence and Evelyn's dual authorization for any future credit inquiries. By Wednesday afternoon, First National's fraud department had opened a formal file on the HELOC application. The forged authorization, the scanned ID, the intercepted tax bill, and the tablet messages were all preserved. Kelsey had not just failed to get a loan, she had built an evidence package against herself. Martin Cole kept his job, but not his reputation inside the bank. Then Evelyn turned her attention to the Eleanor Bennett Revocable Trust. Adam had originally been listed as the successor trustee, the person who would manage the estate if I became incapacitated. By Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn had drafted a formal amendment stripping him of that role. Adam was relegated to a conditional beneficiary, subject to strict oversight, meaning he would not see a single dime of the estate unless he met a series of rigorous, lawyer-approved milestones. Kelsey, of course, was legally barred from the property entirely. Evelyn arranged for a professional moving company to pack up the rest of their belongings from the upstairs guest rooms. I didn't even have to look at them. The movers simply boxed up the expensive athleisure wear and designer shoes and drove them away. I spent Wednesday morning at the post office, permanently revoking Kelsey's mail authorization and setting up a secure PO. Box for all financial documents. When I got home, I went straight to the living room. The massive wedding photograph was still leaning against the coffee table where I had left it. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I picked it up, carried it out to the garage, and slid it face down behind a stack of old paint cans. I walked back inside and stood before the fireplace. The faint square seam of the wall safe was still visible in the walnut paneling. I opened it one last time, changing the code from August 14th to a random string of numbers generated by Evelyn's office. I placed the deed, the trust documents, and Eleanor's USB drive back inside the wall safe, but I kept one printed copy of Kelsey's text messages in the red folder. Eleanor had labeled it Signatures and Security. Kelsey had provided both. I closed the heavy steel door until the locking bolts clicked securely into place. Then I heard a knock at the front door. It was Nora Alvarez. She was holding a covered casserole dish in one hand and a small toolkit in the other. "I brought lasagna," Nora said, stepping into the foyer. She looked past me into the living room, noting the bare space above the fireplace. "And I brought a level. I thought you might need an extra set of hands." I smiled, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen for the first time in a week. "I would appreciate that, Nora. Thank you." We ate the lasagna in the kitchen, sitting at the small breakfast table instead of the dining room. Nora didn't ask probing questions about the dinner party, and I didn't offer any dramatic retellings. We simply talked about the weather, her garden, and the neighborhood. It felt normal. It felt like my house again. After we ate, I brought Eleanor's portrait out from the study. Together, Nora and I carefully lifted the heavy wooden frame. We adjusted the brass wire on the back, making sure it caught perfectly on the sturdy hooks anchored into the masonry. Nora stepped back, holding her yellow level up to her eye, adjusting the left corner by a fraction of an inch until it was absolutely perfect. Eleanor was back on the wall. She was wearing her blue dress, looking out at the room with that sharp, knowing intelligence, exactly as she had for 38 years. "She looks beautiful, Robert," Nora said softly, resting a hand on my shoulder. "She always did." "Yes," I replied, looking up at my wife. She did. Nora went home a short while later, leaving me alone in the quiet house. The next morning, I opened the sunroom for the first time since Kelsey had called it dead space. Dust floated in the bright eastern light. Eleanor's old writing desk was still against the window, though Kelsey had stacked 2 boxes of designer tile samples on top of it. I carried the boxes to the garage, wiped the desk clean, and placed Eleanor's brass reading lamp back in the corner. Then I watered the last surviving orchid on the sill. Its leaves were wrinkled but green. Not everything neglected was dead. Some things only needed the thief removed from the room. The quiet was broken on Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on the back porch, drinking a cup of black coffee, when Adam's car pulled into the driveway. He got out slowly, looking exhausted and significantly older than his 41 years. He didn't have his key anymore. Evelyn had demanded he surrender it on Monday, so he had to ring the doorbell. I didn't let him inside. I walked through the house, opened the front door, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind me. Adam stood on the front steps, looking down at his shoes. "Dad," Adam said, his voice rough. "Can we talk?" "There isn't much left to say, Adam," I replied calmly. He rubbed a hand across his face, a gesture he had inherited from me when he was stressed. "Kelsey is staying at her parents' house. We aren't talking right now. Her dad is furious about the embarrassment at the dinner, and she's blaming me for not standing up to you." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline I wasn't going to throw him. "Dad, I'm sorry," Adam said, his voice cracking. "I really am. I never wanted this to happen. I knew she was pushy, and I knew she wanted the house, but I swear to God, Dad, I didn't think it was fraud. I just thought she was handling the paperwork for the renovation. I looked at my son. I saw the little boy who used to play on the rug in the living room, but I also saw the grown man who had allowed his wife to wrap his mother's face in a damp towel. That is because you kept calling theft inheritance, I told him, my voice devoid of anger, but heavy with a profound, immovable disappointment. Adam flinched as the words hit him. Dad, you kept calling it inheritance, I told him, but inheritance begins after death. You tried to spend mine while I was still making coffee in the kitchen. You should have stopped calling my life your future, Adam, I continued quietly. You looked at this house and saw equity. You looked at my age and saw an opportunity. You let your wife forge my name because you wanted the money without having to earn it. I just wanted to make her happy, Adam whispered defensively. And in doing so, I said, you proved to me that you would sell the roof over my head just to keep the peace in your own marriage. I stepped back inside the house. I didn't slam the door. I just closed it. The heavy oak shutting with a solid final thud. I locked the deadbolt and walked away, leaving Adam standing alone on the porch to face the consequences of the bed he had allowed his wife to make. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear, pouring through the east-facing windows of the sunroom that would never be demolished. I woke up, put on my robe, and walked downstairs. I went into the living room. The morning light hit the canvas above the fireplace, illuminating the warm blue of Eleanor's dress and the sharp, protective intelligence in her eyes. I reached out and touched 2 fingers to the bottom edge of the heavy wooden frame. I didn't do it because I believed she was trapped in the house. I did it because she had proven, once again, that she was the only one who truly understood how to protect it. Kelsey thought a portrait was just a picture. Eleanor knew better. A picture can guard a wall. A wall can guard a safe. And a woman who loved her home can still protect it, even after someone tries to take her face down. Asterisk, if you were Robert, would you forgive Adam because Kelsey pushed him into the loan? Or did standing silent while his wife removed his mother's portrait prove he had already chosen inheritance over loyalty? Let me know in the comments.